Since last March, the James Beard Foundation has been hosting virtual events and industry support webinars like this one to help navigate the challenges of COVID-19, provide resources for the hospitality industry, and to better stay connected through difficult times. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, here are some quick housekeeping. All right, so the webinar is being recorded. We'll post a link on this recording to openforgood.com after the program wraps. And you can always email impact@jamesbeard.org if you're having trouble accessing the recording, and we can send it directly to you. If you have questions for the panelists, please write them in using the webinar toolbar. We'll try to address a few questions at the end as time allows. And then if you're having technical difficulties, just message us using that same webinar toolbar, and we'll do what we can to troubleshoot. I'll be keeping an eye out while A-dae is moderating, and we'll be happy to assist. So today's moderator is A-dae Romero-Briones, the Director of Programs for Native Agricultural and Food Systems for First Nations Development Institute. She's a Fulbright Scholar, has her Juris Doctorate from Arizona State University's College of Law, and LLM in Food and Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas. Rochelle Adams, Indigenous Engagement Director at Native Peoples Action, is from the interior Alaskan villages of Beaver and Fort Yukon. She has a master's in Applied Linguistics from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and has worked as a cultural enrichment specialist for the Anchorage School District, as an Alaska Native language educator, and an Alaska Native cultural advisor. Denise Livingston of the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance is a food justice organizer and the Slow Food International Indigenous Counselor of the Global North. She's one of the United Nations Food Systems Summit 2021 champions, is a member of various action groups and advisory boards, and holds a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Nevada. Dr. Roslyn Lapierre is an award-winning author, ethnobotanist, and environmental activist. She's an associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana and a research associate at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution. And then finally is Vanessa Casillas. She's the internship coordinator and business manager for the Gatherings Café in Minneapolis. Her goal is to utilize her skills as a third-generation Mason to build ovens and outdoor cooking spaces for tribal communities and gatherings while maintaining her position with the Gatherings Café. A-dae, you want to take it away from here?
Sure. Gwetsi se hopa hin weka nime asa watyats kutyetime osuta koi mahada. It's so nice to have everyone out there in the internet universe join us today. It's an honor for me to see the beautiful Indigenous faces of many of my sisters in different parts of the country and the world who are fastidiously committed not only to our food systems, but to our communities. And so before we get started, I just wanted to ground us in a few things. If you have a chance, let us know where you're tuning in from. There's a chat function if you can let us know what city and state you are tuning in from. Also, thank you for joining us there's so many other priorities that we could have and be doing right now. So it's an honor that you've come to spend this time with us. And so I ask you just to open your heart, to open your mind, to open your life to some of the wisdom from our guests. And lastly, I know the topic is Indigenous women in America's food systems, and that's sort of like a hook, but really Indigenous women are the heart of many of our Indigenous nations. And so while we say America, we're talking about Navajo Nation, we're talking about Blackfeet Nation, we're talking about Ho-Chunk, we're talking about our Alaskan villages, and these predate the title of America. So just keep that in mind as we're having this conversation. And lastly, I want to say thank you to our distinguished panelists. There's so many roles that Indigenous play in our nations. Not only are we the heart of our food systems, sometimes we have to be the doctors, sometimes we have to be the professors. Sometimes we have to be the builders. There are so many roles that Indigenous women play, and sometimes the titles don't capture that spirit or capture that heart. And really, I look forward to hearing what folks have to say today. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Rochelle to begin just an introduction from the panelists themselves. Rochelle?
Masicho. Thank you. Trinjanai, Shijanai, Nahwas Inshaw Isi. I said, women and my friends, I'm so happy to see you all. Shojrit Rochelle Adams Oji Kuchajet Sendudink Edat Juk Anchorage which Dilak Nai Diné Nai Nango Anditi Chukutritagos and Native Peoples Action and Jit Cultural Advisor Eastlead, PBS and Jit Molly of Denali Chan. So Jukdrin Chitri Roncha. So hi everyone, my name is Rochelle Adams. I was born and raised in the villages of Fort Yukon and Beaver in the interior of Alaska. I'm living in Anchorage now on the homeland of my relatives, the Denaina Athabaskan. Chinan to them for being the original stewards of this land. It's an honor to be sitting amongst my sisters here. And I also said that I work for Native Peoples Action as a Indigenous Engagement Director, and I'm also the cultural advisor for the PBS show Molly of Denali. And so I'm really happy to be here. And I also said my heart is really happy, so it's an honor. Masicho.
Roslyn?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roslyn Lapierre. I am both Blackfeet and Métis, originally from the Great Plains of what we now call Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. I always want to acknowledge that I come from two educational knowledge systems. I was educated first with my family and my community. I apprenticed with my grandmother and my oldest aunt to learn ethnobotany and traditional ecological knowledge of my family and my community. But then I also went to Western education. I have an undergraduate degree in physics and a PhD in environmental history. And I am currently, my job is working as an associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana. But I'm really active in my community and then also sort of nationally with a lot of different environmental justice issues, but also issues centered on just promoting positive development for our Indigenous communities. So thank you, the James Beard Foundation and First Nations Development Institute for today's webinar.
Thank you, Roslyn. Denisa?
Hello, everyone. She Denise Livingston and she had to kill the cheating nation. She should deny Bashachin, Ose deny touching Dasha, don't honest as a touching Dashanella. I used to dance Nasha a Tadagon Wolia, dear what are the Nishila. So hello, everyone. I just introduced myself in my language and very honored to carry the clan my mother gave me and passed to me and my grandmother. I'm from the Red House People clan. I am Diné. I am in the Four Corners area of the US in Turtle Island. And then also I am from a community called Mitten Rock, and I'm very proud to speak about that, which is located behind the famous Shiprock Pinnacle. And also I am very honored and thankful for today and all of you as I speak from my Diné homelands here, and thankful for this discussion amongst my sisters. And first of all, I just like to say that we don't look like what we've been through this year. And it's just a very empowering time. And for me and the group here for DCAA locally, we have been really involved in exploring what it means to expose community currencies and leveraging off of the talent, skills, and the passion, expertise, the time of our community members, giving new roles to society where we stepped in to again renew what has been out there since 2012 is the Healthy Diné Nation Act of 2014, which is an unhealthy foods tax, and using the expertise of community members to be able to bring an unhealthy foods tax and awareness of Jian, which is unhealthy food, and also the role that it has played as we face nutritional trauma, you know, when our ancestors were faced with that, and even now, and what we're going to come out, you know, from the pandemic with this, looking at the collective impact and roles of women and how the exclusion exists. Even in our communities, even though we come from a matrilineal, matriarchal society, that we're able to expose some of these issues, and really just diving into Indigenous public health. It's really important for us to take control of that and also create curriculum and also opportunities for us to leverage that with community members. And the other thing is social gastronomy, just really having the power of Jian, Yahateki, which is you know, healthy food, healthful food is medicine, and how do we use that to be able to reconnect to our relationship with one another, to our planet animal relatives, to the systems that were placed on us, and how do we use that as a tool to be able to overcome, to put pain to purpose, and then also teaching the community members about servant leadership and how to serve one another, especially during this time. How do we serve out of trauma? How do we serve out of grief? So that's a place that I'm coming from in the spaces that I'm holding, and very thankful to the James Beard Foundation and First Nations Development Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Denisa. We will touch on some of those very poignant comments. Vanessa?
Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Casillas and I'm Ho-Chunk. I'm originally from Chicago and I have ties to Wisconsin of my Ho-Chunk lineage, as well as the Twin Cities here. So I find myself in Minneapolis again, just relocated before the pandemic. So it's been a really interesting time to read and also change in career paths. As you heard in my introduction, I am a third-generation Mason and a bricklayer by trade, who as a hobby really, you know, enjoyed working with foods. I'm a self-taught baker. My grandmother was also a baker, and my dad is an amazing cook as well as my mother. So really, I just had a love and a passion for working with food and caring for community. And when I landed in Minneapolis, I saw there was work to do to keep elders fed early on in the pandemic. What really touched me was the news, seeing how other countries were kind of putting elders on a back burner, and just knowing that our Native communities can be treated that way to begin with. We're really worried as to what was going to happen in the pandemic. I didn't want them to, that they were forgotten. And there was other Indigenous chefs and cooks that worked to assemble and get meals out to elders. So the Gatherings Café is a social enterprise of the Minneapolis American Indian Center. We function, one, to allow the local community to have access to healthy Indigenous foods, and then two, to train people. So we train folks in working foods and in a kitchen and get them job ready. So my position is to kind of shape the curriculum, and I'm very conscious about wanting to integrate that Indigenous pedagogy to tie in elders to guide us through food systems, reconnect with foodways in our community, really think about not just where the food comes from, but our responsibility to foods and to our community, so that we can be good stewards towards one another and our overall urban intertribal community that we are part of.
Thank you, Vanessa. And just to touch on what some of our panelists said, I can't emphasize to the audience like what a treat it is. And I think when we ask ourselves what kind of food system should America want, or what are the differences between an American food system and an Indigenous food system, you know, one of my first answers is like, you see the panel, like we're women. We have such an important role in our lands and in our communities, and how we raise our plants as well as our children. Like we are the bedrock of Indigenous food systems. An American food systems that's often dominated by men, the female voice is not always heard, but you will hear it strong and loud today. And with that, I'm going to ask Rochelle, because really when we talk about food systems, when we talk about Indigenous women, and we talk about community, you know, those are very powerful concepts. Like, how do all those things come together in your work, Rochelle?
Yeah, Masichoa, thank you. You know, to me, when I think about our food system, it's really our connection to place, you know, our lands and our waters. And as Indigenous people, this goes back to our creation. And we all have our stories of creation, you know, when in my area, it goes back to muskrat, when muskrat finally pulled up that chunk of land. And, you know, when you think about it, it's such an honor to continue this way of life, you know, to be so connected to our home, you know, the lands, the waters, our Indigenous place, and all that call that place home as well, our fish, plant, bird relatives, you know, all of that. And so I don't look at it as something only that only I'm doing. You know, it's something much larger than myself. And it's just so amazing to see Indigenous people holding space as land and water protectors to protect that original stewardship. And I mean, there's so many ways that we're doing this. And in my work, you know, I'm a linguist. I continue the languages of my culture, my people, and my area. Our languages were developed, you know, as we grew alongside that homeland, you know, with our plant relatives and birds and fish. And so as we're learning and continuing our languages, that continues that connection. And there's so many ways of that too. I mean, when you learn your language, you open doors into that knowledge. I remember opening a door when I learned about the directionals, and that's how we talk about our world in relation to the river. So, so it's really tightly connected. And our food relationship, I mean, now in Alaska, we have a little bit different makeup of, you know, what we call the lower 48. And so in Alaska, I'm a Alaska Native Corporation shareholder. I'm a tribal member. You know, I'm a citizen of the US. And so our lands are very checkerboarded, and the layout of our land looks a lot different. And so Indigenous people have quite a challenge to the rights, you know, to our hunting and fishing and food sovereignty. So that in and of itself is quite a challenge. I'm a fisherwoman, and you know, my family were hunters, and my dad was a trapper, and I grew up really tightly connected to our land. You know, our family has a story for every bend of the river and, you know, every trail. And it's just such a beautiful thing that, you know, Indigenous people have that and can continue that knowledge. But it's important that we maintain that stewardship over our land. And for me, you know, we're really tightly connected to the seasons, and we follow that traditional seasonal cycle. Hunting, you know, when the migratory birds come in, and, you know, fishing for the sukcho, the king salmon, when they come up the Yukon River, and, you know, our moose hunting. And so all of that is regulated in some way. And, you know, it takes a lot of advocacy for Indigenous peoples to be able to have that. And I'm also, you know, the Gwich'in Nation, we're within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so there's been a really long-standing fight to protect that area, that's a Porcupine River caribou herd, you know, where they live and where they have their calves. And so we've been protecting that area from oil development for a long time. Our elders tell us to go out and do it in a good way. And so that's what we do. You know, we share the story of our people and how we protect that land base. And yeah, so that's a little bit of it. Just really looking forward to this conversation and really diving deep into that.
Thank you, Rochelle. I can't wait to hear more about the muskrat and the river. And I'm sure some of that comes through in Molly of Denali. And if you haven't seen it, I would encourage our audience to look it up. It's a pretty beautifully well done show, and much of that is thanks to Rochelle. Roslyn, you opened up a whole other topic area, the connections and relationships between Western education and Indigenous education. Tell us a little bit more about that, and tell us what you're working on.
So thank you. Once again, thank you for inviting me today to be part of this conversation. So I really wear two hats. I work at the University of Montana in the Environmental Studies Department, but I also work back home with a community-based organization called Sokyo Heritage. And Sokyo Heritage was created about 13 years ago, and the purpose was to honor our Indigenous knowledge, but do it in a modern context. And so one of the things we do at Sokyo Heritage is we conduct workshops and gatherings to teach other young women about harvesting and gathering, or what's now called foraging. And we really focus mostly on plant-based foods and plant-based medicines. And we're currently working on this great project with a group of students from Harvard University. Harvard has a class right now on Indigenous governance, and they have their students who are from all over the US, a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are working with communities to do projects on public policy. So one of the questions we get asked a lot at Sokyo Heritage, because we do these workshops on gathering and harvesting, is like, what is legal and what's not legal, right? Like, where can I go, where can I not go? Do I need to have a permit? Do I not need a permit? And so one of the things we've asked these students to do is create kind of a guidebook for us that we can put on our website and that we can then share with people in the community so they can know where on public lands, at least out here in Montana, but kind of Western United States, where is it legal in state public lands, federal public lands versus like tribal lands, to go out and do their gathering and harvesting. So that's one of the hats I wear, is working with Sokyo Heritage to do just those kinds of activities for our community members and for people even just nationwide, because we have it open, we have all the information out on our website. The other hat I wear is in the academic realm. So I work, as I mentioned, at the University of Montana, and in the Environmental Studies Department, I teach classes on traditional ecological knowledge, on Indigenous health as it's related to the environmental health of our lands and our landscape. The research that I do at the university, though, is really centered around Indigenous women's knowledge, and again, that plant-based knowledge. So plant-based foods, plant-based medicines. And to give you an example of a project that I recently did, I just recently wrote a very short article. I work on a yearly basis with a local organization here called the Montana Natural History Center, and they have a magazine called the Montana Naturalist. So I write articles for them. I recently did one on moss, which is prairie turnips, or Petiolum esculentum, which is the scientific name. But it's prairie turnip is a very common, well-documented, well-used food across the northern Great Plains. And one of the things I'm really interested in is being able to document that ancient knowledge, that Indigenous knowledge that Indigenous women and communities hold, and again, kind of take the sort of ancestral knowledge and bring it up to the modern context. How do modern people use it today? How are our young people learning about these things? And today, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, I'm going to end here in a second. You know, most of what we know now and what we share now is on Instagram, right? Or is on Twitter. And so even though we hold, like I said, we hold gatherings and workshops in the community, a lot of times that information then gets kind of put out into the cyberspace, and it gets shared that way. And I think that's just a modern way for us to learn from each other and for us to become much better stewards of the land and the landscapes that we call home. So thank you.
Beautiful. Pedia esculentum.
Pediomelum esculentum.
Esculentum. I hope the audience is looking that up. So Vanessa, we're gonna just jump to you very quickly. You told us a little bit about your journey to gatherings, Café, and who you serve, which is you and your love of elders, but you also work with youth. Can you tell us like how those two populations come together, not only in your work, but in how you think about Indigenous food systems? Because that's a very important topic.
You know, so our employment training program isn't only for youth, but we do tend to get more youth than for folks. We're open to all ages in that. One of the things that I've been working on is partnering with Dream of Wild Health, who has, are you guys familiar with the name Hope Flanagan? She works with Dream of Wild Health and she knows a lot about plant medicines and the environment and harvesting protocols. So I've been partnering with them to host Zoom sessions that will lead up to a harvesting walk. So we've just been meeting a few times via Zoom so that we can learn from Hope and kind of center her teachings and her guidance. And then we're going to eventually get out to harvest. And I think it's important to make that connection, not only so that we value the knowledge that the older generations carry, but that we empower the youth to know that it's for them to take up. And this is also open to all the Café staff here to participate in. So, you know, in our philosophy, it's really about carrying that responsibility towards our food, which also incorporates learning and teaching and being open to knowledge. You know, it's been quite a journey for me to shift gears from construction to working with food. I love working with food, but I'm more in the office now. So just trying to kind of like sculpt what the curriculum would look like for the Café, for our trainees, our interns. I really have to think in the perspective of somebody who is becoming introduced to these foodways and to a different system of learning, and how to best incorporate that along with the teaching talents of our head chef, Brian Yazzie. So it's, you know, it's really about also being flexible, changing with the seasons, of course, because our first class was at the end of February until the end of March. The next session will be a little bit different because it'll be springtime. We can maybe work with the soil some, and then summer session will be a little bit different than winter and spring session. You know, so it's really about learning and responding to our environment, responding to what we have available. And also, you know, for the next 2 years, we're going to be continuing to feed elders while also training people to work with food. And eventually, as the pandemic lifts, we're going to be open to the public. Because right now, we are closed to the public. So it's quite a big feat for our team, but you know, also having a space that we can cultivate that is nurturing, that is as free from toxicity as we can aim for. You know, in the kitchen space, you know, I come from a background that is very male dominant in my work environment, and it was very toxic a lot of the time. So when I came into the kitchen space here at gatherings, what hit me was just how I felt just so nurtured, you know, and how it wasn't just, it was, I think because we knew that the food that we were making was going out to feed elders, we had to put that energy into it. We were always thinking, oh, what are they going to think when they open this box of food? You know, look at, if there's a big rib in there, like, are they going to be like, hey, you know, getting down with this rib, this is amazing. But, you know, putting that love into it, thinking of how the recipient was going to receive the food. And we also try to teach that to our interns, that what we cultivate with our hands will nourish, and our energy will be passed on that way. So we do try to be mindful, because I think it also really designs our meals and our menus. You know, we have to be mindful. People who are working with, are they being spread too thin? Are they exhausted? We have to just be very aware of one another, our responsibility, like I said, to the food, but also towards one another and our broader community. So that answered the question.
Yes, Vanessa, thank you. And we're speaking to the James Beard audience, who is, you know, primary in the food space. So your descriptions of nurturing and love probably resonate well, but they definitely speak to Indigenous food systems. And we're going to turn it over to Denisa for a bit. Denisa, Navajo, you come from Navajo Nation. You right behind the pinnacle of Shiprock. We've all seen and heard about the devastation that COVID-19 has had on your community. You mentioned we all don't look how what we've been through in the past year, which is like speaking truth, because we've all been devastated in Indian country, but a lot of attention has been paid to Navajo Nation. Like, tell us about the role of food and your organization and women have had in response to some of what's happening in your community.
Thank you, A-dae. Thank you everyone for sharing. As we set the example of what it means to create a framework to empower our communities through the Healthy Diné Nation Act, which has raised over 7.5 million and funded over 1,000 community wellness projects, we set the example in Indian country and in the nation, in the rest of the world, of how Indigenous people can create these frameworks to empower the community. We also set the example in COVID about revealing the disparities, especially during COVID, putting a pandemic on top of current epidemics and seeing the architectures of disparities and how those systems have flourished and have done what they were intended to do, to harm our communities, to put us at a very vulnerable level, even more than we've ever been. And early on in the pandemic, the narratives that were going out were more of a narrative of what leaders were doing, but what was happening at the local level was we were convening, women were getting together, local organizers were coming together, we were buying sewing machines, we were sewing, we were making masks, we were distributing food, you know, even before leaders were doing this. And for us, you know, it was really about that relational equity. How do we come together in a space when we face disparities and inequities, and also how do we gain, you know, collective action and synergies to be able to survive? That was like the really crucial element about, you know, how we're facing this. And I always tell everyone, you know, that we are on a road trip. Pretend that we're all, you know, in this car and someone has to drive. There's a co-pilot, there's supporters, there's people that are funding, you know, what we're doing, but we're all getting to the same mission of trying to improve health, trying to overcome what we're dealing with, trying to be like our ancestors, being resilient. They were resilient. We're just learning how to be resilient. We're also learning how to increase our adaptability quotient. And women, we are holding all of this knowledge and wisdom and tools that came from our grandmother, came from our ancestors, and we should never feel that we are alone. As long as we have our seeds and our plants, we are never alone. And during this time, I've been speaking early on in the pandemic, really reaching out, speaking on the radio from New York to Berkeley, and talking about the narratives, talking about the local narratives, advocating for contact tracing early on before we see the cases rise, and being able to function in this space where we're trying to reach out. It was almost as if we had our community members crying out loud, but no one really hearing. And so what we did was really get that narrative out through many different platforms and speak, you know, to what is disaster justice. And early on, we worked on disaster justice curriculum and looking at, you know, the continuance of operations, you know, how do we react, how do we serve, how do we prepare ourselves? And one of the biggest things is that women were organizing, and my mother, my grandmother, 3 generations being in the space, early on, mom said, you know, here's a big bag of beans. And when mom drops a big bag of beans and says, you got to be prepared, you got to be ready, that was a big message to all of us that we had, you know, something was coming and that we had to be prepared. And so for all of us to be able to serve first responders, you know, support local Indigenous businesses, support our leaders, support our community members. I mean, there was so many different tasks and roles that we played, and then as well as reaching out to the larger communities about how do we empower, especially with the lack of PPEs, with the lack of testing. There was just so many different disparities that we've seen. And so for us, getting our apron on, early on, we were sewing about 2 years ago, and people were like, why are you guys sewing? And, you know, it's like, we are so, maybe for the purpose of sewing masks, maybe for the purpose of like improving, you know, these skills. And we started, you know, doing more sewing and getting our aprons on and knowing that we had to reactivate the power of our kitchens. How do we bring sovereignty to the kitchen table to be able to maneuver during this time? And I think, you know, for all of us, you know, having that resting place and stewardship and knowing that the intentionality of what we're doing is important about the planning and the process of how we empower our communities, especially from the local level. And so it's been quite a time for us. The narrative now, you know, is that, you know, what is happening in the Navajo Nation. Of course, we see in the CARES Act funding and the completion of some of the projects, but we've seen early on with the World Health Organization telling the world that you have to activate community engagement. We all have the collective responsibility. We all have the collective power to be able to be responsible for our healing, because if we don't do that ultimately, then there's going to be others that will profit from our pain, profit from our trauma, profit from the inequities that we see and a lack of systems that empower us. And so I'll stop there, and thank you for that question.
Wow, Denisa, that was a lot to take in. One, but I love the theme of we have to activate our kitchens. And so this question is for the entire panel. Like when you think about Indigenous women and you think about the work you do, whether it be organizing an internship program or writing about traditional ecological knowledge or helping frame an entire PBS series on Indigenous people, some of these roles are not typical food system roles. Like in the mainstream often thinks of a chef or maybe a sous chef or maybe a server. Like what do you want people to know about Indigenous food systems with particular attention to the roles women play in them?
Yeah.
I'll start. You know, I think that there's a lot of intersections, and this is something that Indigenous communities, we're used to all of these multiple intersections coming together, and we don't silo things as much as we see in other communities or other cultures. So we will see the connections between, you know, language revitalization, you know, restoring our food systems, you know, having our respect and our reconnection with elders, and then also looking at how do we create a new type of stewardship and a relationship with the land. And we see all of these things connected through food, right? And we also see all of those things connected. One of the themes that has been brought up today already is public health. You know, restoring our food systems is really important to connecting back to our public health systems. And by public health, again, thinking about it in broader terms, not just sort of the Western definition of public health, but Indigenous systems of public health from the past to the present. And I think that we see all of these connections and we see how all of these things are integrated together. But oftentimes, like I said, non-Native community will often see things in those silos. You know, oh, you do Indigenous, you know, language revitalizations. Like, yeah, I do these other things too. You know, oh, you just do this. Well, no, I do all these other things too. So when we talk about wearing more than one hat, you know, we see all of those connections together. And I think that that's something that's a real positive in our communities, and something that not only as a positive, but as kind of a cultural value that we have that we can share with other communities about the way that we approach things differently, and we approach them through just a kind of multi-layering of understanding how all of these different systems work together. And when you strengthen one, you strengthen all of the others. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Yeah, so nicely put, Roslyn. Oh, masicho. Yeah, I was going to say, you know, food really is a centerpiece of our culture. You know, it's what brings us together. And I just wanted to share my master's project was called Chara'a, and that means we're eating. And you know, around, and as it pertains to like linguistic, you know, language revitalization, it really is that centerpiece of our culture. I mean, for us in Alaska, as a northern Diné or Athabascan woman, our potlatch is really how we center our life, you know, and coming together. That's how we celebrate or mourn, or you know, just it's really integral to our life. And having that potlatch and honoring, you know, our place and our foods and our connections and our hunters and gatherers, you know, because food is much more than nourishment. I mean, it's our spirituality, it's that wholeness, you know, it's our occupations, it's the physical wellness, it's emotional, connects us to environment, you know, it holds our intellectual property rights and like all of that. It's everything. We have this microcosm of knowledge that's just in, you know, for example, the moose. I mean, we have such a deep connection to that, or the caribou, or the salmon. You know, we're connected. And something that I think is just so amazing is when, you know, when my family goes into the smokehouse. To me, that's like a church, or you know, whatever you want to make that connection to. It's our relationship to a higher power. It's something larger than us. It's creation, and Egwa, that it's creator, is us being connected to that and being able to be so tightly, you know, intrinsically connected to our land and waters, and to practice that, and to go into that smokehouse and to keep the fire burning. It's incredibly amazing, and it's something our ancestors did, and it's something that we want to make sure that our grandchildren will do. And so I wanted to share that, and I can't express enough how much that means to us, to have that, to carry on that tradition and have our food sovereignty as Indigenous people, because our wellness is so important, you know, especially now. And when Native people can go into the hospital and have their native foods, we know that's where our wellness lies, and we have that knowledge within us. And so we're grateful when, you know, we can advocate for that in like policy and make those systemic changes to where we have access to those types of things. So, masicho.
That was both Roslyn and Rochelle, beautifully stated. Vanessa or Denisa, do you have any contributions to the conversation before I move on to the next portion?
Yeah, I'd like to share, you know, early in the pandemic, we were seed saving and growing and distributing seeds, thousands of seeds, and the stewardship of doing that and the process of doing that during a pandemic was, we really saw the harvest in a pandemic. You know, many times we know that, you know, carrying those seeds is very important, you know, for even this year, for next year. And not only the seeds of, you know, growing our corn, our beans, our squash and melons, really the seeds of love and hope and joy and resilience. And recently we are invited by the CDC, Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country, to hold a 2-day online retreat about how are we holding grief and care? How are we going through this time holding and processing the traumas? Because many of us, you know, we have to juggle and also understand the traumas and the momentum to be able to serve communities. And in this space, we're able to speak about, you know, what relational intelligence is and what a harvest this in a pandemic means, and also just giving mindfulness to the time that we're in, and also being responsible of, you know, our own healing. And how do we do that? How do we hold space to ensure, you know, that we're coming through this time not just carrying, you know, that grief, but also processing and allowing for those healing strategies to be activated, and talking about, you know, what is Indigenous self-care? What is Indigenous self-love? You know, is it drinking green thread tea? Is it braiding my hair? Is it going, you know, to different activities, or, you know, doing a plant walk, or, you know, planting? What is that? And I think we're not putting enough value on that, you know, as women, and we need to hold those spaces even more during this time, so that we come out stronger. We come out, you know, more resilient. We come out, you know, with those things that are activated that we've never been through because of convenience, that has, you know, suppressed those tools and those skills and talents that have been passed on to us. And so for us, you know, growing through COVID is something that has been very precious to us, and just raising awareness about the nutritional deficiencies and the nutritional traumas that we face, especially in our communities, where we see a rise of food swamps, you know, where it's just nothing but unhealthy food. And as you know, our organization have been advocating for more healthful foods, and we've seen bags of sugar being passed out during this time. We've seen harmful foods, you know, being given by those that are not from our communities, and we advocated against those. And you know, this year, how do we make sure, you know, that our communities are getting the nutrition that we need? I mean, of course, it's going to take generations to do that, but I think, you know, that we have a platform, especially how we're all baby Zoomers now. We can connect more, and we can, you know, plan more and strategize more, you know, and before we would be meeting in person in conferences, I would see you all in person, but now we have, you know, more time availability to meet, you know, quickly, and also in a wider platform. And so I just wanted to share that and just emphasize, you know, how important it is, you know, to hold that care, and also the self-love and the self-healing, you know, for all of us, because leaders need that, you know, to be able, and women need that to be able to help our communities even more, because we're going to come out with more trauma than we've ever imagined. So thank you for letting me sharing.
Yeah, that was, you guys touched on so many things, and I have so many thoughts going through my head. And you know, I'm continuously inspired by Indigenous women, who are the seed holders who pass on seeds that have existed a long time for us. Reawaken them sometimes. I've started my own garden this year, and in doing so, it's taught me so much. It's taught me to be in tune with the cycles, and how that really affects the gravitational pull of these little seeds and the water content of them, and kind of gives you a broader aspect of where you are in this world, how you exist and how you navigate it. And that's something that I learn a lot watching other Indigenous women, is watching them, how they navigate their space, how they pull others in, how they empower others, how they bring up the talents and the values that people can't see within themselves, and up forward. And pulling from that, I was really inspired by some other Indigenous women who have done really important work. And I wanted to participate in a bartering market this summer or this fall, and getting produce and stuff to our communities here. And that work is already being done, but now that I'm in the position I'm in, I can kind of amplify and echo that to kind of, you know, allow it to have a broader wave. You know, we're a little unique in that we're an urban Native community that is comprised of many different tribal nations, and you know, we don't really have a way to self-govern in ways that tribes do because of our location here in Minneapolis. But that doesn't mean that we can't focus on reviving and rebuilding food sovereignty. Just have to be very creative about the way we do it. And we have to also remind folks in our community that they can be empowered to do that too. We do have land, there are plants and medicines everywhere. And sometimes when I need to take a break, you know, I'll walk around here in the few blocks around the Minneapolis American Indian Center, and I'll try to identify all the plant relatives and see who I can see. And that helps to ground me in that we are still in our environment, a concrete and urban feel and urban elements. We're still in our environment. And I think Indigenous women really helps to bring that balance and the reminder of, to focus on our energy, our contributions. We need to think more seeing of all the dynamics that exist within our communities and our work. And that's something that I'm continuously reminded of this woman and inspire me.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I do think we're having issues with your mic. You're going in and out. So
I'm gonna turn off the fan.
Just so you know that. Okay. So before we end the webinar and actually switch to a few questions, we do have a few minutes for questions at the end. But before we get to that, very quickly, one of my most favorite questions on this webinar series is to ask our panelists to tell me what their most favorite traditional dish is and who is serving it to you when you think about that. Anybody can go.
I'll share. So my favorite food, and it's been my favorite for a long time, is fried moose heart. And we usually have that the morning after our fresh harvest. And it was served to me from my late father, who he passed a couple of years ago, but he would get up early and make fried moose heart and blueberry pancakes and, a breakfast. And that was my favorite food.
My grandmother used to make, so the Blackfeet historically ate foods that were very low fat, right? So all the plant-based foods had no fat in it. Most of the game meat was very low in fat. So one of the things that the Blackfeet had to do was supplement that diet with eating fat, right? So there were different ways that they added fat to their diet. And one way was they took the fat of game meat. So historically it was bison. And they would save it, they preserve it by mixing it with peppermint. And so they chop the peppermint up really small, and they'd mix it with the fat. And they created this thing called peppermint fat. And then they would take that and slice it off, and you would just eat it. And I guess it's kind of the way people really like bacon today, right? Bacon's just, you're basically just eating fat. But peppermint fat is the same way. It's just you kind of slice it off and eat it with your food, and it's pretty yummy. So
Yeah, I think for me, corn is a big one. It's very versatile, and especially blue corn, it's my favorite. And I actually was going to eat some this morning. I was like, no, my tongue's going to be blue when I'm talking. And so I'll have it after this. But tadnil is what we call it. Blue corn, like atole, blue corn mush with some topped with some sumac, some 3-leaf sumac from here, and also some pine nuts. We did a lot of pine nut harvesting this past season, and so that's my favorite. But I think my ultimate favorite when it comes is really the dried deer. I remember, growing up with that and pounding the deer and then, refrying that and having that, as a blessing. And there's so many foods, but corn can be used in so many different aspects of stew and corn tortillas, or, making different dishes, and Three Sister stew, whatever that is. But those are my favorite of this time. Thank you.
I think for me, it's just hard because I love just like harvesting berries. That brings back so many good memories. But I probably have to say a good venison steak with some mushrooms that have been sauteed. That's it for me.
And you work with Chef Yazi, so
I know,
think that's
spoiled.
a good answer. My favorite, of course, is just like plain beans. My grandma used to love just like beans, breakfast, noon, and night. It didn't matter, and I'm the same way. I did think we had enough time for questions, but I actually think we took up all our time. So Debbie, if you don't mind putting everybody's face with their handles so people know how to ask our panelists questions directly, please do so. And again, I want to thank our panelists for all your comments today. Again, Indigenous women are the heart of our nations. And Roslyn, you said it well, is like we all have to wear different hats and we have to have different skill sets and we have to be able to see the connections when other people can't, because that's what building nations means. And I think, Denisa, you also said it well, in that when we're building nations, we have to think about our healing and how food either empowers or inhibits that nation building. And Rochelle, you said it too, like we do this in a good way. We come to this work with good intentions, good hearts, and with the faces and voices of our ancestors. And Vanessa, like we're building, whether it be with foods or with blocks or with mason blocks, we are building and we continue to do so. And again, it's an honor to be here with you women. And I hope the audience finds value in everything you said today and come find you on the Twitter handles listed. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. Thank you, A-dae, as always, for incredible moderating and for organizing this panel. And thank you, of course, to our audience for being a part of it and for sharing a little bit about you and where you're watching from. It was wonderful to get to know everybody just a little bit. Please check out the other upcoming events and webinars that the James Beard Foundation has going on. If you really liked this one, you can go to openforgood.com. One coming up that could be interesting to many of you is the vegan edition of our Know Your Black History webinar series, which is happening on the evening of March 17th. So check out that if that sounds interesting to you. And then you can visit jamesbeard.org/investment-fund. I'll put that up on the screen. If you'd like to learn more about or donate to our fund for Black and Indigenous American business owners. So that's it for us today. Have an awesome rest of your day, everyone. And thank you again all so much for being a part of this awesome conversation. We'll see you next time.
Miigwech, Gerigano Matson.
Thank you.
Aheha, everyone. Thank you.